December 1941 did not just ignite a war. It shattered the fragile balance of power across the Pacific. Within months, Japan had carved an empire stretching thousands of miles from the Philippines to the Dutch East Indies, from Wake Island to Malaya. Every island, every atoll, every airfield was part of a defensive lattice designed to slow any enemy advance. From the outside, it looked impenetrable, a fortress across the ocean, a moat made of water, coral reefs, and air power. But behind the map, fragility lurked. Japan's offensive network was a marvel of planning. Airfields bristling with fighters and bombers. Naval bases stocked with fuel, munitions, and repair facilities. Coastal artillery interlocked to cover landing zones. Each island reinforced the next, creating overlapping fields of fire and inter-island support. The perimeter was measured in weeks of supply lines, hundreds of miles of shipping lanes, and thousands of trained soldiers dug into coral and jungle. On paper, an attack on every fortified position would guarantee a massacre. Doctrine demanded total conquest. There was no room for improvisation. Yet America faced a grim calculus. Every Japanese stronghold was a potential bloodbath. Every assault risked hundreds, possibly thousands of casualties. And the Pacific was wide. Too wide. Thousands of miles of ocean stretched between targets, making logistics a nightmare. The United States could not simply hit every island and expect to sustain momentum. Every ship risked torpedo, mine, or kamikaze attack. Every landing craft could become a coffin. The strategy planners drafted in Washington seemed almost impossible in practice. The Japanese Empire had speed, surprise, and entrenched positions. But there was one weakness. The spine of the empire was fragile. Supply lines stretched across thousands of miles of ocean, dependent on oil, food, and ammunition shipped from the home islands or Southeast Asia. Remove that spine, and entire garrisons would collapse, starve, or surrender without being attacked. The map made it seem endless. The reality was brittle, and this is where the idea of island hopping began, not as a doctrine, but as a question. What if victory did not require attacking every stronghold? What if, instead of brute force, the United States could selectively target critical nodes, airfields, ports, and choke points to strangle the empire piece by piece? Strategically useless islands could be bypassed. Strongholds could be isolated and rendered irrelevant. It was not a plan to conquer territory. It was a plan to dismantle the enemy's ability to project power. The psychological impact of this realization was profound. For the Japanese commanders, the vast Pacific was a moat, a shield, a buffer against invasion. For the Americans, it was a challenge to be solved, a puzzle where not every piece needed to be moved. The genius of island hopping lay not in attacking everything, but in understanding what mattered. Every bypassed island was a trap for the defenders. Every captured airfield a lever to tighten the noose. It was a strategy as a scalpel, not a hammer. It was war at a distance, with precision and patience, as dawn broke across the Pacific. The question was clear. How do you beat an empire that stretches across thousands of islands without fighting everywhere at once? The answer was simple, yet revolutionary. Isolate, bypass, and constrict. Strike where it counts. Leave the rest to rot. And in doing so, transform the ocean from protective moat into a medium of attrition. Island hopping was about to begin. The first step would be small. The first victories were measured, but the implications were enormous. Japan's empire appeared vast and invincible, but its Achilles heel had already been identified. America would not win by brute force. It would win by understanding the architecture of the enemy's strength, and then tearing apart one decisive strike at a time. The stage was set. The Pacific was wide, dangerous, and deadly, but every island counted differently, and a campaign that would redefine amphibious warfare, naval strategy, and modern logistics was about to unfold. Island hopping was not just about islands. It was about the spaces between them, the invisible lines that carried fuel, food, ammunition, and men. For every fortified beach, there was a supply chain. For every airfield, a route of resupply. And for every naval base, a lifeline stretched across thousands of miles of ocean. To confront Japan directly meant challenging not just troops, but also logistics. To conquer territory was to attack the veins of an empire, and the United States realized early on that those veins could be severed without touching every node. The Pacific War was as much a war of movement as of firepower. Aircraft could strike from hundreds of miles away, but they depended on fuel and forward airfields. Carriers could deliver air power anywhere, but they were limited in numbers and vulnerable to attack. Supply convoys were both lifelines and targets. One successful strike against a shipment of fuel or ammunition could cripple an entire garrison. Island hopping did not ignore Japan's strongholds. It leveraged them. By bypassing fortified islands, the United States transformed them into prisons, cutting them off from resupply and reinforcing the illusion of invincibility while secretly strangling their operational capacity. Strategists identified which islands were critical. Those with airfields in range of Japan, harbors that could anchor American fleets, and locations that blocked or controlled supply routes. Others could be ignored. Every bypassed island became a liability for the Japanese, a position that drained resources and tied down defenders who could no longer influence the broader theater. This was not guesswork. It was a careful calculation, identifying points that dictated the rhythm of the war, and seizing them to bend the map to American advantage. By controlling key nodes, the United States would extend the reach of its carriers, shorten bomber range, and isolate Japanese forces without engaging every enemy soldier. The challenge was immense. Each leap forward required a precise sequence: naval bombardment, carrier airstrikes, amphibious landings, establishment of temporary airfields, and continuous resupply. Misstep at any stage could be catastrophic. Yet the Americans learned fast, adjusting plans in real time. Doctrinal manuals could not prepare them for coral reefs, monsoon rains, or entrenched bunkers. Success depended on initiative, improvisation, and coordination across the Navy, Army, and Marine Corps. Each landing became a miniature test of integrated warfare, a rehearsal for the larger campaign. The Japanese were confident in their perimeter. They assumed that the vast ocean and heavily fortified islands would prevent rapid advances. They did not anticipate that the United States would treat geography itself as a weapon. By taking only what mattered and leaving the rest isolated, the Americans reshaped the battlefield. Every airfield captured pushed the bombing range closer to Japan. Every harbor seized enabled faster resupply. Every bypass fortress became irrelevant, yet still consumed Japanese attention and resources. The strategy was invisible in action, but devastating in effect. WWII early 1942, this strategy had begun to show results. The Gilbert Islands were seized. The Marshalls were surveyed. Carriers could operate with new freedom, and Japanese garrisons began to feel the isolation that would define their final months. Doctrine had assumed that attacking every island was necessary. Reality proved that selectively targeting strategic points could achieve greater effect with fewer casualties. The Empire's outer ring remained strong in appearance, but the inner architecture was already compromised. Every victory added leverage. Every bypass stronghold added pressure. The map was not shrinking in territory. It was collapsing in influence. Island hopping demanded patience, precision, and a different way of thinking about war. America was no longer trying to defeat Japan at every point. It was exploiting the architecture of power, leveraging mobility, and striking where it counted most. Supply lines, airfields, and harbors became as lethal as bullets or bombs. Japan's empire was vast, but strategy allowed the United States to act decisively, efficiently, and invisibly. The first phase of conquest had ended, but the campaign itself, the carefully orchestrated tightening of the noose, was just beginning. And as every skipped island became a strategic liability, the Japanese would begin to realize, far too late, that their seemingly unassailable perimeter was already under siege. By mid-1942, the theory of island hopping had been tested in small raids and limited assaults. On paper, bypassing fortified islands sounded clean, elegant, almost painless. Reality, however, was brutal. Every landing revealed a harsh truth. The Pacific was a battlefield of extremes. Coral reefs shredded landing craft. Swirling surf pinned troops under fire. Dense jungle swallowed visibility. The enemy was patient, disciplined, and relentless. Japanese defenders did not retreat when bombarded. They waited, concealed, and struck with devastating precision. Tarawa became the first warning. Marines waded through chest-deep water under heavy machine gun fire. Landing craft sank on coral outcroppings. Thousands of rounds were expended to reach the beach, and yet the defenders had prepared cleverly, interlocking bunkers, tunnels, and trenches that extended inland. What seemed like a secondary target on the map was a fortress in practice. Casualties mounted faster than reinforcements could arrive. Every lesson learned was paid for in blood. Island hopping demanded more than courage. It required coordination across multiple branches of the military: naval bombardment, carrier air support, amphibious landings, engineers, and infantry. Each element had a function in a precise sequence. One mistake, a delayed landing, a misfired shell, a miscommunication, could unravel the entire operation. Doctrine assumed overwhelming firepower would suffice. Reality proved that terrain, weather, and enemy ingenuity could neutralize advantage. Coral, mud, and jungle became as deadly as bullets. The psychological toll on troops was staggering. Men fought not just against enemy fire, but against exhaustion, heat, disease, and fear. Insects, tropical illness, and hunger gnawed at morale. Marines and soldiers often advanced in knee-deep mud under blistering sun, every step measured against machine gun nests and hidden snipers. The battlefield demanded improvisation. Small unit leaders were forced to make split-second decisions, often without orders. Success depended on initiative as much as planning. Despite the hardship, the strategy proved its merit. Every secured island extended the reach of American forces. Airfields captured enabled longer-range strikes against Japanese supply lines and reinforced bases. Harbors allowed resupply and staging for the next leap forward. Bypassed islands, left isolated, drained the enemy of attention and resources. Yet, the cost was tangible. Casualties rose, operations dragged, and lessons were painfully internalized. Victory was a combination of intelligence, preparation, firepower, and raw human endurance. The lessons learned at Tarawa, Macon, and the Gilberts reshaped American amphibious doctrine. Pre-landing bombardments became longer, more precise. Engineers were embedded with assault forces to clear obstacles immediately. Naval gunfire was coordinated with infantry advances, while carrier-based aircraft suppressed enemy positions. Supply chains were refined, anticipating delays and damage. Every new landing became faster, more efficient, and better integrated, but never without risk. The jungles, reefs, and defensive ingenuity of Japanese garrisons imposed a constant toll. By the end of Part 3 of the campaign, it was clear. Island hopping was more than a strategy. It was a war of attrition and ingenuity combined. The Americans were learning to fight in a new environment, improvising with every landing, adjusting to the unpredictable, and exploiting every weakness the enemy offered. The doctrine was sound, but the execution exacted a price that planning alone could not predict. The key paradox emerged. The strategy worked not because it was easy, but because it forced the enemy into untenable positions. Each battle demonstrated that bypassing strongholds could isolate them, but the price in men, effort, and risk was undeniable. The campaign was evolving, becoming faster, smarter, and deadlier with every engagement. Island hopping was proving itself, but only because American forces endured what doctrine had never fully prepared them for. And as the Pacific battles continued, the question loomed larger. Could the strategy maintain momentum, or would Japan's tenacity and terrain turn attrition into stalemate? The next phase, the strategic shift, was about to test the campaign's limits. By mid-1943, the United States had absorbed the brutal lessons of early amphibious operations. Island hopping was no longer a theory. It had become a refined, relentless system of attrition, precision, and momentum. The campaign was entering its strategic shift, seizing not just islands, but the lifelines that allowed the Japanese Empire to project power. The Marianas, with their deep harbors and potential airfields, were no longer optional. They were essential. Capturing them would bring the Japanese home islands within range of B-29 bombers, enabling a psychological and physical pressure Japan could no longer ignore. The shift was evident in planning and execution. Pre-landing bombardments became massive, coordinated assaults designed to destroy coastal defenses and neutralize bunkers. Naval gunfire and carrier aircraft strikes were synchronized down to the minute. Intelligence reports informed precise targeting. Engineers landed alongside infantry to immediately clear obstacles, build airstrips, and repair docks. The complexity of operations had grown exponentially, yet every detail was executed with a rhythm born of hard-won experience. The campaign had evolved from experimental landings to fully integrated, multidimensional warfare. For the Japanese, the shift was terrifying. They had prepared for frontal assaults, slow attrition, and defensive depth. They had not anticipated that the Americans would bypass strongholds, leapfrog fortified islands, and target logistical nodes with surgical precision. Every captured airfield, every operational harbor, every secure island became a springboard for the next assault. Meanwhile, bypassed garrisons were left isolated, slowly starving and psychologically crushed. The illusion of the Pacific perimeter's invincibility was unraveling. The battles in the Marianas demonstrated the campaign's new tempo. Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were stormed with overwhelming firepower and coordinated precision. Japanese defenders fought ferociously, often refusing to surrender until cut off entirely. Yet the Americans exploited mobility, communication, and relentless pressure. Amphibious landings were faster, naval bombardments more accurate, and air support continuous. Islands that would have been costly in the early phase were now taken efficiently, their airfields quickly operational to support subsequent assaults. Every victory amplified the campaign's momentum, but the shift was not just tactical, it was psychological. The Japanese high command realized that their perimeter was being systematically dismantled. The strategy of bypassing minor islands, once questioned, had forced them into untenable positions. Isolated troops ran low on supplies, morale plummeted, and the fear of encirclement dominated every decision. Meanwhile, American forces, strengthened by lessons learned, adapted constantly, maintaining initiative and keeping the enemy off balance. Speed, precision, and coordination had become a force multiplier. The strategic shift also revealed the importance of logistics on a massive scale. Each captured island needed rapid resupply and infrastructure development. Airfields had to be operational in weeks, harbors repaired quickly, and supply lines maintained across hundreds of miles of ocean. Every misstep could stall the campaign. Yet the Americans learned to synchronize every branch of their military, from the Navy to the Marines, engineers to the Air Force, creating a web of efficiency that turned logistical challenges into an advantage. The Pacific itself became an operational theater leveraged to compress Japanese options. By the end of Part 4, the consequences were clear. Japan's empire, vast on paper, was being systematically crippled. The combination of isolated garrisons, captured airfields, and relentless American momentum had fundamentally altered the operational landscape. Island hopping had evolved from survival-driven improvisation to a strategic juggernaut capable of projecting power across thousands of miles, reshaping the map of the Pacific. The stage was set for the campaign's climax, where attrition, morale, and decisive operations would determine the ultimate fate of Japan's empire. The campaign had shifted. Momentum was now the weapon, logistics the engine, and the American approach an unstoppable sequence of calculated strikes. Every captured island tightened the noose. Every bypassed stronghold highlighted Japanese vulnerability, and every operational victory reinforced the inevitability of the empire's contraction. The question was no longer if the strategy worked, but how much longer the Japanese could resist. By late 1944, the brilliance of island hopping was showing its human and operational costs. The Americans had advanced hundreds of miles, capturing key islands, constructing airfields, and extending the reach of their carriers and bombers. Yet the very speed and precision that had enabled these victories now strained every facet of the campaign. Casualties mounted. Supply lines stretched to their breaking point, and even the most disciplined troops felt the toll of relentless operations. Island hopping, once an elegant strategy, was now a war of endurance as much as ingenuity. On Peleliu, Leyte, and other contested islands, the Japanese defense had evolved. Commanders no longer relied solely on frontal engagements. They dug deep into caves, bunkers, and tunnels, forcing Americans into grueling house-to-house, hand-to-hand combat. Every step forward exacted a toll in men and equipment. Artillery had to pound positions repeatedly. Engineers cleared obstacles while under fire, and medical teams worked tirelessly to save the wounded. The battlefield became a crucible of attrition, where speed alone could not guarantee success. Logistical pressures compounded the problem. Each newly captured island required immediate resupply, airfield construction, and harbor repair. Ships were stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean, vulnerable to enemy submarines, storms, and navigational hazards. A single delay could cascade into operational paralysis. Supplies arrived late or damaged. Fuel ran low, and ammunition shortages forced commanders to make agonizing choices. The very system that had delivered rapid advances now demanded flawless execution to maintain momentum. The psychological impact on troops was profound. Men who had endured the initial landings with determination now faced the cumulative weight of exhaustion, fear, and uncertainty. Tropical heat, disease, and relentless combat frayed nerves. Leaders were forced into split-second decisions under extreme pressure, balancing the need to maintain initiative with the necessity of preserving their forces. Discipline and morale were tested daily, and even seasoned veterans felt the edge of fatigue. Every operation risked breaking the delicate balance that had made island hopping effective. Meanwhile, Japanese forces exploited the constraints. Bypass garrisons launched guerrilla raids, targeting supply convoys, isolated units, and forward bases. They forced the Americans to divert resources to secure rear positions, further stretching an already overextended system. Mortar fire, snipers, and booby traps became tools of attrition, turning previously bypassed islands into persistent threats. The illusion of seamless momentum began to crack as the campaign entered its grueling mid-phase. Yet, despite these challenges, the campaign pressed forward. The Americans adapted constantly. Engineers innovated to clear coral, mud, and jungle obstacles more quickly. Air support was synchronized with ground advances to suppress entrenched positions. Logistics planning anticipated delays, and redundancies were built into supply lines. Every difficulty forced improvisation, creativity, and coordination. Success was no longer measured simply by territory gained, but by the ability to maintain operations under extraordinary strain. By the end of Part 5, the paradox of island hopping was evident. Speed and precision had carried the campaign far, but they were not limitless. Each victory carried the cost of human lives, exhaustion, and operational fragility. The strategy had outpaced the enemy, but it also outpaced the resources and endurance of those executing it. The Japanese Empire was reeling, but the Americans now faced a hidden challenge of sustaining the campaign over thousands of miles of hostile ocean and terrain. Momentum was still the weapon, but only because the system held together under extraordinary pressure. As the Pacific Theater approached its climax, the stage was set for decisive operations that would determine the fate of Japan's empire. Attrition, strategy, and the limits of endurance would converge. Island hopping had brought America to the threshold of victory, but victory would demand more than speed, more than planning. It would demand resilience, adaptation, and a willingness to pay the ultimate cost. By late 1944, the momentum of island hopping had carried the Americans deep into Japanese territory. The once vast perimeter of the Japanese Empire was fragmented, isolated islands surrounded by miles of open ocean, their garrisons cut off, starving and exhausted. The strategy that had begun as rapid, precise assaults now faced its final test. The cumulative strain of attrition, distance, and human cost. Every landing was measured, every casualty cataloged, every supply shipment vital. The campaign was no longer a theory. It was a harsh reality of protracted amphibious warfare. The capture of Iwo Jima and Okinawa exemplified both the power and the limits of island hopping. Japanese defenders had fortified every ridge, cave, and bunker. They had abandoned conventional tactics in favor of attrition, tunnels, hidden artillery, and suicidal counterattacks. Marines faced relentless fire, advancing only meters at a time. Casualties soared. Medical teams struggled to evacuate the wounded under continuous bombardment. Yet, despite the immense cost, every foothold gained extended America's operational reach. Airfields became launch points for B-29 bombers, harbors enabled resupply, and every captured island tightened the noose around Japan. Logistical mastery remained critical. Ships crisscrossed the Pacific, carrying fuel, ammunition, rations, and engineering equipment. Supply lines, stretching thousands of miles, were constantly threatened by weather, enemy submarines, and navigational hazards. Delays or losses could disrupt operations and threaten lives on the front lines. Commanders had to balance speed with caution, ensuring that the next landing could be sustained. Island hopping demanded relentless attention to detail, Coordination between Army, Navy, Marines, and Air Force became the backbone of success. One misstep could unravel months of planning. The psychological and human cost was undeniable. Soldiers faced endless combat in tropical heat, disease, and relentless enemy fire. Fatigue, fear, and grief tested morale at every turn. Japanese soldiers, too, suffered, cut off, isolated, and slowly consumed by starvation and hopelessness. The strategy that had emphasized bypassing strongholds forced them into positions where surrender was not an option. Both sides endured a grueling mental and physical toll, a testament to the extremity of modern warfare in the Pacific. Despite these hardships, island hopping proved its strategic brilliance. Each bypassed island became irrelevant. Each airfield captured increased operational flexibility, and each port secured accelerated supply and reinforcement. Japanese forces were systematically isolated and neutralized without the need for direct, prolonged assaults on every fortified position. The campaign demonstrated that speed, coordination, and selective targeting could achieve strategic objectives even in the most hostile environment. Yet, it also revealed a harsh truth. No strategy could eliminate the cost of war entirely. Momentum carried victory, but it demanded endurance, sacrifice, and adaptation to be why the final month of the war, Japan's empire had shrunk to a handful of islands, each strategically irrelevant without resources or reinforcements. The lessons were clear. A well-executed operational strategy could dismantle a far larger power through precision, coordination, and initiative. Yet the human and logistical demands were extraordinary. The campaign had tested planning, improvisation, and endurance to their limits. Island hopping succeeded because America adapted faster than Japan, exploiting both tactical and psychological vulnerabilities. In conclusion, island hopping reshaped modern amphibious warfare. It was a strategy that combined speed, precision, and attrition, systematically dismantling Japan's empire while forcing the enemy into untenable positions. The victories were decisive, but they were achieved at enormous cost. Every captured island told a story of coordination, courage, and sacrifice. Every bypassed stronghold revealed the subtle genius of isolation over destruction. The campaign proved that strategy, when executed with discipline, ingenuity, and relentless momentum, could overcome even the most formidable defenses, but only when tempered by endurance, logistics, and the unyielding resilience of those who carried it forward. The Pacific War had been won not simply by force, but by the careful orchestration of speed, pressure, and unyielding determination. Island hopping was both a weapon and a lesson. Momentum could destroy empires, but demanded the highest price from those who wielded it.